Hey everyone, it's Michael. Today is the second of two bonus episodes that I recently mentioned, and features an interview with journalist and podcast host Justin Glanville. Justin is the host of the podcast Mary and Bill, an Ohio cold case, which does a deep dive into the double murder of Mary Petrie and Bill Sproat from Columbus, Ohio. In 1970, Mary and Bill were just two college students living in Ohio. Mary was a student at Mount St. Joseph University, while Bill was a graduate student attending Ohio State University. On Friday, February 27th, 1970, 20-year-old Mary caught a ride from Cincinnati to Columbus to spend the weekend with some friends and her boyfriend, 22-year-old Bill, but their bodies were discovered the following morning in Bill's apartment. They'd been brutally murdered, having been bludgeoned, stabbed, and strangled. Bill had been bound before being killed, and it's believed that Mary was sexually assaulted. Justin, the journalist that decided to look into the story 50 years later, has a personal connection to it, which we discussed during our conversation about this mystifying case that's seemingly been forgotten to time.
So my name's Justin Glanville, and I am a producer for the NPR station in Northeast Ohio, which includes Cleveland and Akron. And I ordinarily cover stories of people in their neighborhoods. And so this project, Mary and Bill, is very much outside of my usual wheelhouse, although, as I'm sure we'll touch on in our conversation, it ended up having some interesting parallels with the kind of community storytelling that I ordinarily do.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, I was just, kind of interested because I did look up a little of your other coverage, and it seems very untrue crimey. So I was just kind of interested how you made the segue into this, and I know that you do have that personal connection. I don't know if you want to talk about it in this format, but
yeah, just
your personal connection to the story. Like, what about Mary and Bill made you want to do such a deep dive into it?
Yeah, well, and like you, Mike, I am a true crime listener, and I do find it just really fascinating to look into some of these cases. I do tend to like the more serious investigative subgenre, I guess, of true crime.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of this whole comedic strand that's kind of taken shape more recently that I'm not as much a fan of, but
agreed.
I grew up watching unsolved mysteries and stuff like that. And yeah, this particular case, as you mentioned, I have a family connection to, and my parents would talk about it from time to time when I was growing up, because my mom was a friend of Bill's, and they were both at Ohio State University together when this happened. And in fact, the weekend that it happened, my dad was down visiting my mom, and Bill's roommate, so Bill Sproat is the male victim in this case, his roommate was also staying at my mom's apartment the night of the murders because he was dating my mom's roommate. I know that's a lot of people to try to keep track of. At any rate, the next day, when the roommate, whose name was Tom, went back to the apartment, he discovered the bodies of Mary and Bill. And the scene was so gruesome and brutal that he initially told reporters he thought he saw 3 bodies. And the first call that Tom made was actually back to the apartment, at my mom's apartment, asking my dad to come over because he had found some dead bodies. And so my dad went over there. By the time he got there, Tom had also called the police. It was a crime scene. My dad showing up kind of unannounced and randomly at this crime scene raised some suspicion. So he was taken into custody, put in a police cruiser, taken out of the station. And they viewed him as a suspect actually for a while in this case, to the point where they came back and questioned him further. So the fact that my dad was kind of involved in that way, plus the gruesomeness of this double homicide, the details I'm sure we might get into a little bit later, but just a very, very brutal crime and a clear case of overkill. compared to the Manson family murders, et cetera, which had been the year before. Really, I guess traumatized my parents might be the best term for it. And just always was this thing that remained in their memories of their youths, and that they would, they brought up from time to time. I always say it was mostly like on long car trips and stuff, when we would just be kind of going back over their past. So, gosh, 3.5 years ago, I just decided to, and I can't remember specifically what provoked me, but I just decided to start poking into the case to see what, if anything, had ever happened with it. And I found out pretty quickly that it was pretty big in the news for a couple of weeks, and then it just completely fell under the radar. And I didn't understand why. And I thought that, this case deserves way more attention than this. Bill and Mary deserve way more attention than this. And that's what got me started on the whole path.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. I just recently listened to the podcast. It's, I think, 7 episodes. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to me was when you received the paperwork after your FOIA request, and you found your dad's name on some of the original police reports. I can imagine that must have been super jarring just to see in a, investigative sense.
It was, and people joke with me. They're like, "Gosh, your dad sounds so chill on the podcast," because I have both of my parents in that, especially in that first episode, and he was, which is kind of my dad's personality. But when I saw that, and when the police then subsequently asked to re-interview my dad all those years later, I really did have this pit in my stomach at first, like, oh my gosh, what am I getting my dad back into by sniffing around at this again? But I think his stance was always, there just couldn't possibly be any real evidence against me, because he had never actually set foot in Bill's apartment. So, but me, I would have freaked out a little bit more, because again, I grew up watching Unsolved Mysteries and Hitchcock movies. So,
yeah,
the wrong person gets arrested for crimes all the time in those movies. So,
yeah. Well, I can only imagine how difficult it's been for you to look into a cold case from half a century ago. How did your previous experience as a reporter kind of prepare you for that? And what's been the most challenging part of looking into this for you?
It is challenging that it's such an old case, because number one, most, if not all, of the law enforcement personnel who were involved in this case back in 1970 have passed away, because they were some of the first people I looked up, after getting in touch with the 2 sisters, to make sure they wanted me to do this. I next looked for people who had been involved in the original investigation, and, they've passed away. The police who are working the case now, after kind of submitted those FOIA requests and the sisters started asking questions and so on, it is an active case again. It was never closed, of course, because it wasn't solved, but I'd say it's being actively investigated again. But the police were not super interested in talking to me, to put it mildly. And it was really only because of the sisters getting back involved and their requests for me to be involved in some of the conversations about the investigation that I was able to get really any sort of access to the police at all. So that was a big challenge, but I guess I'm glad that I at least got some. And there were moments, Mike, during the whole process when I'm like, wow, if I were an experienced crime reporter, I'd probably know how to handle these cops a lot better than than I'm doing. But some of my colleagues have assured me that no, that's just the way sometimes cops are. You never know. Sometimes police really want to cooperate, and they really want to use the media and storytellers to help solve cases, and then other times they're very territorial. And unfortunately, that was the case a little bit more with me.
Yeah, it seems like when you started the podcast back in, I think, 2020, when you started doing the research, they seemed more receptive and willing to talk. But then over time, as they reopened the case and realized that there were still active lines of inquiry, they just kind of closed up and stopped cooperating.
That's exactly right. And I
Yeah.
think that to an extent they were open with me initially because they wanted to talk to my dad again.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, so, as soon as they were able to do that, that's when they kind of became pretty tight-lipped. But I'll also say that, you know, a pandemic happened. There
Hmm.
were a lot of things that kind of interrupted my own trajectory, I guess, of being able to pursue this actively.
Yeah.
I became a parent. I'm sure you can relate to that.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
so there were some things that kind of interrupted my flow a little bit too. Who knows?
Mm,
That might have also played into into the communication or lack thereof as well.
yeah. Well, I guess something I wanted to ask you about is throughout the podcast, you attempt to recreate the timeline of events, which
Yeah.
obviously after 50 years is insanely difficult. Um, but near the end of it, you kind of start to come up with this like this theory, I guess, that Mary entered the crime scene as it was unfolding. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And maybe I can back up and just talk a little bit about the crime itself.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so, as I mentioned, this was a double homicide, and Mary Petrie was an undergraduate student at the College of Mount St. Joseph in Cincinnati. So she was coming from out of town. For those who aren't from Ohio, that's about a 2-hour drive, 2.5-hour drive from Cincinnati to Columbus. She caught a ride with some friends, one of whom I speak to in the podcast, and was dropped off just outside Columbus, and then caught a taxi to Bill's apartment. This was around 6:30 that the cab driver saw her walk into the apartment. Um, the next thing that anyone can fully attest to is, of course, the discovery of the bodies the next day. And both Mary and Bill had been bludgeoned with, it's believed, a bowling ball that Bill and Tom used as a umbrella holder. It was a Tester
Mhm.
bowling ball. Um, Stabbed repeatedly, many, many times. Mary was stabbed 23 times in the back, Bill 16, and then
Yeah.
also strangled. Um, so, so kind of going through the timeline, and this was also coming from things that the police were telling me and Martha, who is Mary's identical twin sister too, is
Mhm.
that it started to seem more and more like possibly Bill was incapacitated in some way before Mary arrived. I think part of that might also be coming from the fact that that friend that I talked to that I mentioned who shared a ride with Mary from Cincinnati, she mentioned that Bill was supposed to pick Mary up at the hotel. And for some reason, Bill never did that. So that's part of the reason that police believe that um, that Mary may have walked into his attack in progress. Another thing is forensically, if you look at sort of the coroner and autopsy reports, it appears that perhaps Bill was attacked first, although it seems like he died second.
Mm. Yeah, that's just it's really tragic, and it's really interesting kind of the looking back at this crime scene from 50 years ago and trying to like in the podcast you try and recreate what happened, but there's still such a cloud of mystery over how everything unfolded. And even in one of the episodes you speak to a I forget who it was, but a forensic expert, and they talk about the stab wounds, that they were all very specific to one area, and it just
Yeah.
shows like, I don't know, like a level of odd control from the killer.
Hmm.
It's a very unique crime scene, and it's one that you don't see very often.
It is a really unique crime scene, and look, I haven't looked into as many cases as you have, Mike, or many others who cover true crime. And actually, I'd be interested to hear if you've ever. It sounds like you haven't heard of anything that's kind of parallel. But yeah, I mean, Right. The level of brutality is one thing, but then just there's some almost ritualistic aspects to what seems to have happened to Mary and Bill that are quite odd. And at one point, a tipster in the mid 2000s, when the police did kind of reopen this case and were first submitting some of the DNA evidence at the time, there was a tipster back then who said a religious figure in Mary's life was the one responsible for carrying this out, and that this person's motivation was because she was considering premarital sex with Bill. These two people, Bill and Mary, were both very Catholic. And so, in terms of their background, that kind of makes sense, but it also just seems like kind of outlandish, like almost something you'd see in a movie or something. But the police were taking that tip seriously enough at the time that they were speaking to the media about it. But what we do know, like I said, is just there's some there does seem to have been an element of like torture or ritualistic activity here. I didn't mention that Bill was also bound with wire hangers twisted so tight that police believe pliers may have been used. The pattern of knife wounds on their backs was, as you said, very precise. In both cases, they were clustered under the shoulder blades of Mary and Bill. And so they're in very specific areas with a very specific orientation of the knife. So it just seems like there was something going on psychologically with the person who did this that is bizarre, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Yeah, and it's like I've covered a lot of crimes that are, somewhat similar, like these kind of like sexual assault / murders, and oftentimes there's kind of a sadistic side to it. But like this just seems, with the details of the crime, the belief that Bill died after Mary and that he was bound, she wasn't, that, these weapons were used that were just found at the crime scene. It just seems, I don't know, just very, very sadistic. And especially for the time, it's just, because this was just a year or two after the Zodiac crimes and a year after the Manson murders. So it's just kind of shocking that this never really entered the similar zeitgeist as those crimes.
It is. And I still don't know if I completely understand that. I think that part of it, it's funny, I was just talking to one of my colleagues today about this, and she was saying, maybe it was just so awful that people didn't want to face it, including law enforcement personnel at the time. I think another thing is that, with cases like this, especially when they do go cold, and this case went cold pretty quickly, as I say in the podcast, by August of 1970, which is only 6 months after the crime, police were saying they had no real leads and they didn't expect the case to ever be solved. So when a case goes cold, it's really the advocacy of family, unfortunately, I think most people would say, because, or just someone taking an interest in the case on a personal level that's really going to move things forward. And I think for the families of both Mary and Bill, this was just a really awful thing that in some ways they wanted and as Martha and Pat told me, almost needed to put behind them at some point for a while they lived their lives. Remember, these Mary and Bill were Mary was 20, Bill was 22. These were people who were just sort of starting their adulthoods, and what Martha has said to me is she didn't have the time or the psychological bandwidth to advocate for the police to solve this while she was like pursuing her career and raising kids and all that stuff. And it's really only been since she retired that she's been able to refocus on it. So I think that's part of it. But I agree. I mean, I still don't completely understand why the case hasn't been better known than it was or is.
Yeah. And, just getting back to the point you were making a moment ago about the psychological impact on the victim's family. In one of the early episodes, you mentioned that, Bill's family, they they felt like they couldn't, grieve the same way as Mary's family. And that was because they kind of had this, I don't know, like they felt almost responsible for it. And it's really sad looking back 50 years about how, the victim's family, because this took place in 1970 at this weird transition in America where we were going from, the picket fence to the hippie era. And it was just kind of like this weird transition. And it, like looking back, true crime, like you were saying, like there were no advocates for them at the time, and they didn't know how to keep the case alive. And it's really tragic all the way around.
Yeah, I mean, and you're right, and I think it really speaks to how roles for women and men were a lot more rigid back then, and just the ways that we perceived gender in 1970. It's funny because we think of the 70s as being a really transitional time, and I think they were, but this is 1970, and men were still very much supposed to be men, and one of the things is for men was that they were right, this very traditional thing. They were supposed to be the protectors. They were supposed to be the strong ones. And I think there was a lot of just shame around any circumstance where that appears potentially not to have been the case. Although I think anyone would try to reassure Pat, Bill's sister, that there's clearly no blame to be laid on Bill in this scenario. And, Martha, Mary's sister, has said the same thing to her. But I think it just speaks to the times, like, this, I hope you protect her. I hope you protected her, we felt ashamed, et cetera, et cetera. It's a sad aspect to the case, but I do believe that the sisters getting back in touch as a result of all of us working together on this did maybe start to heal some of those wounds, because they got to really speak about that. You know what I mean? In a way that they hadn't for decades.
Yeah, it's in the podcast you speak to, the sisters, but you also speak to some of their other friends and colleagues from the time. And it's kind of cool getting to hear these people. I mean, not cool, but I guess cathartic almost, hearing them, kind of talk about the case publicly for the first time in 50 years. And you kind of get the sense that for some of them, it's almost their way of trying to make sense of it, like something that for half a century they've probably just pushed to the back of their mind. It's really cool again to hear that.
Oh, that's awesome, Mike. I'm glad I really enjoyed that aspect of it too, because I think a lot of the people I did talk to were grateful to have the chance to talk about their friends again, because and I think it was surprising to me how little folks had been engaged over the years by the police. So, and speaking of the times again, I think there were different perceptions of the police back then. I think there was probably a little more trust in the police overall to be doing their jobs. I think that also came into play, right, with the years of silence was, well, we just have to, we trust that law enforcement's doing the job they're supposed to be doing. And if they needed or wanted to talk to us, they would. There was more of that attitude. So, but yeah, it was great to be able to speak to everybody again. And I know, I think that part too was healing for Martha and Pat, because they got to like hear some memories of their siblings that they didn't know about before, some stories that they didn't know about.
Yeah. One part that really stood out to me back in, I think it was episode 2, maybe, it's where you talk about Bill and how he returned from a trip to France. And, I think a lot of us growing up in like small suburban towns have a moment just like that, where, we move away and then we come back to visit, and then, we tell our families, like, you guys need to get out more. And then the families are just like, look, we work hard, okay?
Exactly.
We don't have time to go visit France. And it's like, there's little stories like that just peppered throughout the podcast that just, illustrate that these were people, and I think a lot of people that listen to true crime often lose sight of that. And I really wanted to applaud you for that, because stories like that just, they make me just, that's what makes me so happy to be a part of like this true crime community. And I just wanted to, compliment you on that, I guess.
I mean, that just means the world to me. I thank you. And, yeah, I mean, yeah, I did that exact same thing, Mike, like when I did my study abroad, in my case, it was in Greece. And, you come back and you think you have all the answers and you're lecturing your parents, about all these things. And so, yeah, I was like, oh, wow. And it speaks to their youth, I think, too. It's like that when you're kind of lecturing your parents about how they should be having wine at dinner and being more sophisticated. I feel like that's so specific to, kind of that late adolescence, early adulthood period that we all go through. So it was really cool that people were willing to share those types of stories.
Yeah. Yeah, just, when you read or listen to true crime, you often get like a very sanitized, idealized version of the victims. And, hearing stories like that just reminds you that like these were people. And in this case, these were two, a 20-year-old and a 22-year-old. And, there was so much more to them than just, the paragraph blurb that's mentioned in every news article about them. And it's just.
Yeah. And, one thing for me too, Mike, is like, I think true crime does get sometimes a bad rap, as a genre that, it's focusing on the negative. It's wallowing in violence. It's exploiting victims, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm saying that all as a true crime, I guess, fan, for lack of a better word. When I was going into doing this, I was really aware of all those criticisms, and I just really hoped that whatever I ended up making wouldn't be seen that way. But coming through the other end of it, I've realized that one of the things that I do really appreciate about the genre is that it can really create a space to talk about grief and talk about loss. And we don't make a lot of space for that in our society and our culture. And I really think that's something that true crime can and does do for a lot of people. I don't think it's just the salacious, like wanting to wallow in the details of crime and darkness that attracts people to this genre. I think it's a way to, think about death and violence in like a safe space, so all of that is just like your comments about and bringing to light those kinds of stories and stuff. I think that was a real insight for me too. It was like, oh, this is why I gravitate toward true crime sometimes, is because I need to feel those feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, I know doing my podcast, I always try and, I try and highlight the victims as more than just victims. Like for me, the interesting part, or I guess the most tragic part, is finding out, like in this case, these people were studying French. They wanted to go live a certain life. And I think that it's important for true crime creators to, focus on elements like that. And I think that helps, keep not only just the story of their grisly murder alive, but also, them as people. And I think the longer that we tell those stories, it's just important to our culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before we get any further in the episode, I wanted to tell you about one of my favorite ways to start the day, Magic Mind. If you're like me, you begin each day by drinking a cup of coffee. Well, for me, that cup of coffee quickly became 2. And if I'm being honest, it's sometimes even 3. But ever since I started taking a shot of Magic Mind alongside my morning cup of joe, I've noticed that the need for more and more caffeine has lessened, and I start each day just a little bit more energized and focused, and a little bit less stressed and anxious. So make sure to check out Magic Mind today. Visit the link, magicmind.com/unresolvedpod, and get up to 56% off of your next subscription there for the next 10 days with the code unresolvedpod20. Once again, that's magicmind.com/unresolved with the discount code unresolvedpod20. That's unresolvedpod20, no spaces or anything. And you could do that to save 56% off of your next subscription. Now we're going to pause to hear a word from some additional sponsors of the show. Well, getting back to some of the grisly details. Sorry, bad transition. But can you speak about the current state of DNA analysis in this case? I know you go through it in the podcast, but the last episode kind of ended off on kind of an uncertain note. I just wasn't sure if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah. I would say I would encourage people to listen, because I think you'll learn a lot about, the ways that the DNA is used at this point and in terms of solving cases. Yeah, I think it ends on, for me, an uncertain but hopeful note. And that hope was a long time coming, because, when I first started diving into this, I mean, one of the reasons I thought that this would be worth diving back into on a pretty detailed level was that I knew there was good DNA evidence in the case. And in this day and age, when you've got good DNA evidence, you've got a really good chance of solving the case. I'm sure most of your listeners know about forensic genealogy. It's where you submit like, if you don't get matches in offender databases, which is usually the first line of inquiry, you can then take this route of submitting to these research firms that look at ancestry databases, and they create a whole family tree, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew when I first started looking into this that there was really good DNA evidence, because some of the rare coverage that happened to this case after 1970 was, as I mentioned, from the early 2000s, when there was a detective who I do talk to in the podcast who took an interest in the case because he had lived in the neighborhood where it happened and he remembered it. And he went back into the evidence box and he found some DNA and submitted it. So what was, and perhaps this speaks a little to my naivete, but when I went into it, I was like, well, okay, so we've got good DNA evidence. And now, back in 2006 or whatever, they didn't necessarily have forensic genealogy yet, but now we do. So, hey, everybody, can we just do forensic genealogy on this DNA? And I did learn that there are some reasons why you can't necessarily jump right to that step, but it was still frustrating to me and to the sisters as well, which you hear in that last episode, that it took as long as it did to get to that point. Because it doesn't always have to take 3.5 years, right, to get to that point. So, but for me, I did end up on a very hopeful note with this case.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask, are there any plans for a follow-up, or are you just kind of waiting for more on the DNA testing?
As soon as we get a follow-up, and I always say, it's a when, not if. I really do believe that there will be complete resolution in this case. So the moment that happens, we will do an update. But I'll say to your listeners that what you hear in that last episode brings you up to, I think, 2 months ago in terms of the investigation. So it's what you have available to you right now is pretty much up to the minute. And as soon as there's any additional information, yes, for sure, we will definitely make a new episode.
Gotcha. Yeah, I just selfishly had to ask,
Yeah,
I just recently listened to the podcast and now I'm just, I want to know more, but obviously there's not a lot more to know.
I will say there's a couple people I'd still love to talk to. And so do you mind if I just put this out there on the 1 in a million chance that someone might be listening? There was a newspaper boy who was at the apartment building the night of the murders who encountered a man on the front porch that he didn't recognize, who told him to get the hell out of here. I have always wanted to speak to, of course, he's now a man and an elderly man, probably. That's number one. And then reportedly, Mary also called a female student at Ohio State the night after getting to Bill's apartment. And I've never been able to find or identify that student either.
Mhm.
So, in the off chance that anybody listening knows or is one of those people, I'd love to speak to them. And we do have a website, Mike, that I'm really proud of, that has all kinds of pictures and resources on it, and also a tip line. So if anyone knows those two people or just has any other information in the case, I'd encourage you to go to ideastream.org/Mary and Bill, and you can get in touch that way.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to put a link up in the show notes and stuff. I remember I was listening to the podcast a few days ago when I was out mowing the lawn, and you mentioned the website, and it was like at a point in the episode where I was like, oh, I got to go look at the pictures, and it was just like I was out there standing in the middle of my yard loading up this website on my phone, and I was like, oh, this must be a funny site. But
oh, you mean like the take a while to load or something? So
yeah, I live in Alaska, so it's everything takes forever.
Yeah.
I'm standing out there with my phone, like load.
Oh, geez. Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry that didn't load for you.
No worries. But no, it's a great website, and I'm really happy that you're doing this. When I started my podcast years ago, it was just I wanted to highlight cases that I thought needed more attention.
Yeah.
And, over the years it's kind of changed, but it's really nice to see that other people are still doing that and highlighting these cases like this that I've never heard about. And now I'm just obsessed and dying to know more.
Well, one thing I've been doing when I've been talking about the case and the podcast with people is what were your theories or takeaways after listening on what may have happened?
So, my own personal theories, from the get-go, I was pretty suspicious of Tom, Bill's roommate, but it sounds like he's been credibly ruled out as a suspect a couple of times. And then, you throughout the podcast, you mentioned that there were some other serial criminals that were in the area at the time, including the North Side rapist.
Right.
So I think that is still like a very credible lead. And, throughout, you also mentioned that there might have been a couple of French guys that Mary was allegedly going to meet up with the following week. And it sounds like that lead has still not been eliminated. So, those are the two that stick in my mind. But while I've got you here, do you have any theories of your own?
I mean, I've gone back and forth, over the years of working on this. Initially, I thought this probably was a crime of opportunity, that perhaps someone saw Mary, who they thought was alone, walking into that apartment building, by herself, and followed her in. One of the things I highlight, and I think it's episode 2, is how lax the security was at that building, especially in 1970. Doors would just be left hanging open all the time.
Yeah,
and there
even
were
weeks after
multiple
the crime.
entries. Yeah, even weeks after the crime, right. So that was my first blush kind of gut instinct about what had happened. But everything that the police have been indicating to us since, and when I say we, I mean me and the sisters, since we've started like being back in touch with them about this, and then also forensically, just the level of overkill involved, is that this points more towards someone who knew them and wanted to hurt them. And so I guess to me, so my mind has gone more in that direction more recently, but I still feel like, why has that person not emerged yet? For someone to want to do this level of violence, it seems like this would have been someone that would have been identified by now, right? By friends or family.
Yeah. Like someone that they would have known about, that had a grudge against them for whatever reason. Yeah.
Right. So I don't, I go back and forth. I think you could argue credibly for either way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so frustrating because, it's been 53 years, and it's just, it's with my podcast Unresolved, like, of course, almost all the stories are unsolved, and there's always just that frustration when you get to the end of the research and you realize there's nothing more. And it's
I know. I know.
You just wish that you had a time machine so you could go back and prevent it or solve it.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be fingers crossed that the DNA testing goes somewhere and that could help lead to some resolution.
Absolutely. Me too, Mike. Yeah, I'm going to be hoping that too. And I really do think it will.
Yeah, fingers crossed, knock on wood.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not just because selfishly I want another episode, but
well, yeah, I mean, these families deserve answers, and nobody in this case is getting related to this case is getting any younger, right? And this is a 53-year-old case, and these families have been waiting, and friends have been waiting a very long time to understand what happened to their loved ones.
Yeah, they definitely deserve it. It's already been too long, and just like I said, fingers crossed. All we can do is really hope now, I guess.
Right. Exactly.
Well, I just want to thank you for chatting with me, and thank you for putting out such an amazing podcast and highlighting the story that I've never heard of, but like I said, now I'm just dying to know more of.
Absolutely. It's been an honor to be on the show.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and if there's an update, we'll have to bring you back and have another chat. Thanks for listening, everyone, and thanks to Justin for chatting with me. I really appreciate him doing so, and I also appreciate how much work that he's put into this story, and I sincerely hope that we get an update from him before long. Make sure to check out his podcast, Mary and Bill, an Ohio Cold Case, from Idea Stream Public Media and NPR Podcast. It's really a great podcast, and a story that I'd honestly never heard of before. In it, Justin goes quite in-depth into various subjects related to the story, and does a great job of telling the tales of both Mary and Bill, as well as the investigation into their murders. Once again, the podcast is called Mary and Bill, an Ohio Cold Case. Now, barring any more case updates, which seem to be happening now more frequently than ever, this will likely be the last you'll hear of me for a couple of weeks. The next season of Unresolved will begin at the end of October, so not too long from now. But I'll try and get some stuff up on Patreon before then. However, I hope you all stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you all again very, very soon.